Hi, everybody, and welcome to another special episode of the Comparative podcast. I'm your host, Subi Sadeh. On this episode, I was joined by David Grosse-Wentrup, David GW, who's a research director from Design Science, to discuss the latest FDA URRA draft guidance. In this episode, David breaks down what's new in the guidance, focusing on its implications for validation studies based on use-related risk assessments. David explains how the guidance provides a formality to some of the practices that industry has been doing informally. He also lays out clear criteria for justifying less execution of validation studies by leveraging things like user context, harm severity, and historical data. David dives deep into the differences between URRA and uFMEA. He talks about comparative analysis, and he details specific approaches for creating compelling arguments. He talks about some of the real world examples illustrated in the guidance, lifecycle management considerations for the risk assessments that are generated, and he talks about strategies for effective communication with the agency. And without further ado, here is David. Hello, Combi Nation. My name is Subi Sadeh. I've spent over a decade in medical device, pharma, and combination product development. Our industry feels complicated sometimes. Drugs, devices, clinical trials, submissions, sterilization, validation, design control, risk management, market access, reimbursement. The list goes on. My goal is mastery, so this podcast is to ask questions I have to people who may have the answers. Each week on the Combinate podcast, I talk to someone about their area to further understand and simplify. Whether you're a pharma person trying to understand the next wave of products, or a device person trying to navigate a pharma system you're unfamiliar with, or a newbie in both areas, I invite you to listen, and together we can simplify by combinating. In this episode, we're going to go over the new URRA draft guidance that just came hot, fresh off the press from FDA.
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe start high level, David, and just talk about what's new in this draft guidance and what difference is there in it compared to some of the other guidances, and some of the other guidances also speak to URRA. So from your perspective, having worked in the industry for a long time now,
Yeah.
what is this URRA guidance trying to clarify?
Yeah, great question. So it's not much that is entirely new. It's more of a presentation of things that we have to some extent already done, even though it wasn't documented anywhere. So it's really spelling out what to do, how to go about it, and touching on a few special aspects here and there that are definitely worth talking about.
What are those?
It's basically talking about the potential of waiving a validation study and how to argue that, and using the URRA or the URRA to make your argument there. So in the past, we've done this and done this successfully, but it was never stated anywhere in the guidances. It's just something that has been working in the past. And now we have actually a guidance document that says, yes, you can build your argument to not have a validation study based on users, context of use, harm severity, all this. And for the first time, really, it spells this out and says, yes, you can, if you have an argument, forfeit doing validation studies for your products, which is the most essential new thing in this guidance, really.
So that's really important. And I think there is the threshold analysis guidance that came out in 2018, which was, I think, really pivotal for generic products, where not only from a practical scientific perspective is it very clearly maybe not expected if you're using the same kind of design footprint, but also the time used to try and conduct some kind of HF study, summative or otherwise, to rationalize or to validate your device from an HF perspective is a significant strain on where in an area where time to market becomes more critical compared to maybe an IND into an NDA kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned that you've seen it successfully done, and now this kind of establishes it. I have seen threshold analysis in my experience used to rationalize not doing a study. I have seen a lot less openness to not doing a study for a new product, even if it's just a basic PFS. So can you
Exactly, yeah.
talk a little bit more about that?
So in the past, the whole threshold path was more tailored towards ANDAs, really. So it was a different route, but I'm certain this is how it transitioned, starting from just the threshold analysis, comparative use, human factor studies, and has now made its way into this more general application here, which it absolutely makes sense, because if you have a product that is identical to something that has been out there for years and is safe and effective, why waste your time, the FDA's time, a lot of money, put things later on the market that could help the patients? I like this practical, reasonable approach here that the FDA is outlining and presenting as an option.
I think where some of the technicalities have come in the past for this kind of thing, and it's not only focused on HF, where let's say you have a product that is near identical, a different disease area, but same user, same use environment,
Mhm.
etc. And you can establish that comparison. As a sponsor, you're often pigeonholed by the fact that you don't have right of reference to
Mhm.
some of the studies that were generated. And so it becomes a situation where you're working under the broad assumption that what you're comparing against has a solid behind it,
Yeah.
and you don't have the right of reference to see or ref or point to it.
Mhm.
And so how have you dealt with that in the past? Because I think that's one of the main constraints, is that idea of you as a regulatory authority have approved it. And so the assumption is that you've looked at it and found their file acceptable, but
Mhm.
I can't use an HF study that I haven't seen as, and we can dive into the details of the URRA. I
Yeah.
can't use an HF study that I haven't seen as a verification of implementation and
Yeah.
effectiveness
Yeah.
against
Yeah.
a risk control that is common.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there's a very good point there. There's different ways to different angles of attack, really. Ideally, you would reference one of your own products. So if you have something that is
Yeah.
in that realm, perfect, then you obviously don't need to worry about the right of reference. Then obviously there's the fantastic drugs at FDA database that actually has a lot of information, including HF validation studies, and that is
When
particularly.
you're sorry, when you say the drugs at FDA, are you talking
Mhm.
about the Orange Book, or are you talking about the, oh, what, I forget what it's
the
called.
the online database, really, where you can look up all the submitted and approved drugs and combination products.
Yeah. The name of it is not coming to me, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're talking
Um,
about the redacted submissions.
exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
that is sometimes a great source of reference. And then lastly, you can do your own research. You can analyze the products that are not your own from a task analysis, risk perspective, user analysis, uses, and draw your conclusions there. Then obviously you don't have the detailed background in terms of the risk, because that is obviously kept to the other manufacturers. But as you said, just by having this product that you then analyze from a competitor on the market for 10 years, there is an assumption of safety and effectiveness, because otherwise it wouldn't be on the market for so long.
Oh yeah, and practically speaking, I completely agree. But so you have seen that approach be successful in
Yeah.
justifying not doing a full. Is it typically accepted as, okay, you've proven your case, makes sense? It's basically validation by
Mhm.
analysis,
Yeah.
validation by documentation, effectively.
Yeah.
Do they ever come back and say, yes, but we need a targeted HF study for a certain subset? Or is it typically a yes, no?
There's often obviously discussion involved, and every case is different, really.
Yeah.
However, what I love about the FDA is that they're open to reasonable arguments. So if you have a good case, if you have enough supportive evidence and arguments for your case, then they're going to listen to it and, in a best case, accept it. So it's really about creating a rationale, a complete, what's the word?
Argument.
Really a complete conclusive argument to prove your point. And if you have that, I've not seen this fail. Obviously, if there's stuff missing, then the FDA will point it out, and maybe you need to an HF study then if, for example, you have a pediatric population that the reference didn't have. There's obviously nuances to it with every product. But in general, if you have a good case, your chances are reasonably well here.
Now, practically speaking, philosophically, and I don't even know if this is really a good question, but I'll ask it. When it comes to the resource management of a study, HF studies take time. The people say, how long does it take to have 15 users run through an IFU? That'll take maybe a day and a half.
Yeah.
People who haven't gone through the study, but the recruitment of the users takes a really long time.
Yeah.
The study setup takes a long time. Getting feedback from internal feedback, let alone agency feedback. HF summative study has a 6-month lead time, let's say, on average, in my experience. So with these kinds of things, it's the yes, no of do you have to do a study or not have to do a study? If there's a feedback to do a targeted study, you might as well just do a full-on study? Just given the fact that you're going to have to take the resource and time to.
That's really a business decision at the end of the day. The benefit here is, let's look at it broader. Building a URRA and building your argument and submitting this to the FDA, you can do fairly early in your development because you don't need the final product or equivalent to that, which you would need for HF validation testing. So you can, to some extent, front load this. And then this is really about business risk management. We've actually seen different approaches where people wanted to save time and money and solely relied on making this argument. In other cases, we had clients that said, yes, we want to make the argument to the FDA, hopefully not need to do a validation study, but let's still do a validation study nonetheless, just for our own. So if the FDA then asks for it, we have it, we can just show it to them. And if the FDA doesn't ask for it, we still have it for our own risk management. We can prove that this is safe and effective, even though we don't submit this to the FDA as a validation study. Because obviously when running a validation, there's always risk. People do crazy things. So having it as a backup, if you have the resources, it can be an option.
Undoubtedly. So maybe that's one thing that you've made a little bit clearer, because in my experience, limited and subjective as it is, the URRA is typically coming on the heels of submitting your protocol. By and large, you submit them kind of together. That's been my experience for an NDA product. I think it sounds like you're saying now with this guidance and framework, the URRA is submitted in its own right.
And the FDA actually calls this out in the guidance in a footnote. And this is very funny. I can talk to that a little more. They point out that when you submit a URRA to make your point that you don't need validation data, don't submit a protocol at the same time to run a validation study. And this is funny because we often have this discussion with clients because they're always in a hurry. Time is money, as we all know. So often we hear this suggestion, yes, let's try to argue not to do it. At the same time, let's submit the protocol to see what they say. But obviously that is undermining your Exactly. And it's undermining your own argument. If you really feel passionate about that, you do not need to do validation data, then don't prepare to submit validation data by submitting a protocol.
And in the US, we say it with your chest.
Exactly,
make your argument. Don't include your mitigation plan as you're making it. So I think one common deliverable as far as HF goes is a uFMEA. And in the guidance, it includes a structure for a URRA that is not that elaborate. It's pretty simple. What's the difference between a URRA and a uFMEA? Is one the subset of each other? Are they related at all? Which one goes first?
That is a very good question. So to quickly answer on the factual level, the URRA, and especially the URRA table that the FDA is outlining, is really a subset of a proper uFMEA. So if you create a proper uFMEA, then you take chunks of it and that will be your URRA. And there's like a meta level to this, because the URRA is really a more distilled, focused representation of it. And this is what the FDA is really asking for. We've seen submissions of clients submitting a full uFMEA that didn't really make the FDA happy. So our recommendation is always provide exactly what the FDA is asking for. Make the reviewer's life as easy as possible. So just submit the data that the FDA is asking for. This is what they are looking for. This is where they feel at home. This makes it easy for them to review. And it just works more smoothly then. But obviously we all have, or every client has, a whole risk management plan, and obviously to 4971. And this is called out in the guidance as well, so that the URRA is really a tool and something to augment the risk management process. And this is how I would see it. It's one of the things you can do. At the same time, it's one of the things you submit to the FDA. So this is how I see it fit into the larger picture.
So just in terms of life cycle management, most companies follow some kind of preliminary assessment before going into their risk analysis, and then they do a mitigation exercise.
Yeah.
From a usability point of view, what that looks like is a task analysis followed by a uFMEA, and then some reconciliation of the risks in a risk management report or whatever. It sounds like task analysis, uFMEA, URRA as part of this submission package. Is the
Yeah.
URRA something that is submission specific to make the uFMEA more digestible to a reviewer? Or is it something that post-review and approval, or post-review and acknowledgement, or whatever, depending on whatever the determination of if you have to run a study or not, it's something that's put in as part of the record, but not continually maintained? Like from a LCM point of view, would you maintain both a uFMEA or a URRA? Or is the URRA just something that was reduced down for submission purposes, but doesn't have to be maintained thereafter?
I would say that is really specific to the risk management plan you have set up. The FDA calls out that the URRA is something to maintain and update throughout the product lifecycle. But if you at the same time have your own entire uFMEA, then it obviously doesn't make sense to have parallel documentation. And as we talked about, the URRA is really a subset of uFMEA data. Maintaining the uFMEA and then at specific points in time distilling and taking out the URRA data and submitting that or working with that is something that we've often seen work.
Now, one thing this guidance emphasizes, I think, is comparative analysis. Now, we've talked about making your case and the argument, and how this may be a new evolution in terms of how these kind of technical HF arguments are made to the agency. But in the guidance, it double clicks a little bit on what comparative analysis is. It talks about labeling comparison, comparative task analysis, physical comparison between the proposed product and comparator, identifying what differences exist between the interfaces, where similar risks exist, that etc. Could you maybe talk about comparative analysis as a broad term, and what does it actually mean practically?
Yeah, there's different elements to it. So in the starting from the threshold analysis part, as you said, there's the physical comparison, where you obviously look at dimensions, textures, materials, all of these things, which then relates to the task analysis, obviously what is done with the physical object that is your combination product, and see what differences are there. Are the buttons the same size? Is the way it works? Does it have the same logical flow? And then obviously, in addition, there's the element of labeling, packaging, on package labeling, on device labeling, IFU. Is the information the same? Is the way the information is presented the same, down to the level of font size, font color, location? So I would always recommend the more detailed you are here, the better your argument. So that is obviously where the core of this comparison is, in the threshold analysis and in these elements. Then, as it is called out in the guidance, there's the additional layer of user characteristics, clinical impact of use error, use environment. So it's really what the guidance here says is consider everything that is relevant. It gives a couple of examples that help you build that argument. But at the end of the day, I would always recommend make up your own mind, determine what impacts the use and what you then utilize to make your argument. And the examples that the FDA here gives is very helpful. But at the end of the day, it's about making up your mind, being the expert, using your knowledge to build the best argument that you can.
Now, the examples that they give is PF. They give one on a prefilled syringe, an emergency auto injector, a lay user auto injector, and this complicated tablet dosing regimen. What do the examples clarify and reveal?
First of all, they present examples for both cases where HF validation data is needed and where it isn't, to kind of make clear where they draw the line. Another interesting element here is that touches on something else that we haven't even talked about with this guidance, that it is not only for classic combination products that have a device constituent part, but could also be applied for something in a blister or something that a medication that has particular dosing regimes to it, that have dosing cards. So this is something I find very interesting, that while this is obviously in the realm of combination products, it already extends a little outward and says even something as simple as seemingly simple as a blister could be related here, and this guidance should be considered for it.
Yeah, and I did notice that it seems like by and large it's the drug-led combination products, but it does have kind of those stipulations. In your own day-to-day, are you seeing more and more of those kinds of products come through for HF evaluation?
Every now and then, really. Obviously, the biggest impact at the moment is home administration of biologics. That is the big driver at the moment. But yes, these other forms of administration, we every now and then see that. Not too long ago, we did an interesting study for a blister pack, where the problem was that kids were getting access to something they shouldn't have access to. So we did a study on the force requirements to pop out the pills out of the blister and to set the force needed in a way that all of the arthritis patients, adult arthritis patients, could open it, but as few kids as possible would be able to get to it. So this is something where something seemingly as a blister pack we did a study for, because once you look closer, there's more to it than that meets the eye at first sight.
Where can people find you, David?
Obviously online, Design Science, Google it. Otherwise, you can find me at conferences. I love talking to people, sharing ideas, sharing understandings of what is currently done and trying to move the industry forward.
Awesome. It was great having you on.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.